Hello, everyone. I'd like to get started. I know that we might have a few more people joining us. I've turned off the little ringer so we won't get interrupted as people join us. Again, you should hear my voice right now, so make sure that if you can't, that you just check your speakers. But thank you for those of you who answered the poll. Okay, just a couple of housekeeping things. My name is Dr. Alicia Shadman. I'm the Director and Associate Professor in the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at Northern Illinois University. And welcome to our first program of the academic year. We're excited that you're here. Right now I have all of your mics muted, but as we get into discussions, I know that Joan Marie would love to have some interaction as we go through this afternoon. So we'll be sure to unmute those as we need it for questions and comments. It's nice if you can turn your cameras on so we can see faces. I know all of us have been through this Zoom stuff the last couple of months. So if you can turn your cameras on, if you're able and willing, please do so. That helps us keep it a little more personal. There will be plenty of time for questions. So as questions come up, please use the chat function. We'll make sure that we're monitoring those, and then we're going to take a break a little bit halfway through to answer some of those, and then also at the end. There will also be a recording of today's presentation, and a link to that presentation along with an online evaluation form will be sent to everyone who registered today. We would sincerely appreciate you completing that evaluation form. It helps us to plan future events. And everyone who registered for today's event will be entered into a raffle, and we have an extra copy of the book that we're happy to send out to you. So we'll be doing that raffle at the end as well. I'm delighted that so many people were able to join us today to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which prohibited the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex. I also want to thank the Center of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Department of History, and the Department of Political Science for helping us advertise and promote the program, and we have a number of their students and faculty joining us today. The Center of Nonprofit and NGO Studies is pleased to host our speaker. Each month we try to feature speakers on various topics, and we had originally scheduled this presentation for spring, and then life happened. So I invite you to go to our website to get a complete listing of our upcoming events. So right now I'd like to introduce our presenter for this afternoon. Dr. Joan Marie Johnson is a historian and author. She's the author of numerous books, including the one based on today's presentation. She's written extensively on Americans' women's history, race, social reform, education, and philanthropy. She currently serves in the office of the provost at Northwestern University. And prior to joining the provost's office, she taught American women's history at Northeastern Illinois University. And the subject of her talk today comes from her most recent book published at the University of Carolina Press in 2017. She was formerly the co-founder and co-director of the Newberry Seminar on Women and Gender at the Newbery Library in Chicago, and she received her bachelor's degree from Duke University and her Ph.D. in history from UCLA. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Johnson. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I'm just really pleased. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be able to talk about philanthropy as well as the anniversary of the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And so I'll be talking a little bit about the ways in which women were making change for women. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And the question that I wanted to start with is to have some of you throw in the chat maybe some women philanthropists that you're aware of, whether they're historical, sometime from the past, contemporary, maybe someone you know, maybe yourself, maybe someone more famous. I could give one away. I mean, anyone could name Oprah Winfrey, right? So I'd love to see who you can come up with and how many women philanthropists we can name. So while I kind of start talking, why don't you go ahead and throw some of those in the chat, and then maybe in a little bit we'll take a pause and see who we've come up with. So for this talk, I wanted to go ahead and start with a letter from 1891 that M. Carey Thomas wrote to Mary Garrett. These are women who were friends and later partners in Baltimore. Their fathers were both on the board of Johns Hopkins University. And at that point, when Johns Hopkins the man had died. He left his estate, and it was supposed to be for a college, a hospital, and a medical school. And they built the college, they built the hospital, and they ran out of money to build the medical school. So he was looking for funding, and Garrett had the idea that she could offer $100,000, but only on the requirement that they admit women on the same terms as men. So she did, and as you can see, if you can read the handwriting, Thomas writes back to her and says, "You do not realize Mr. Gilman's grim determination. It is with him a death struggle. And money weighs nothing with him. Unless the med school opens within a year or two, it will open without women." So, what was the power of philanthropy? What could Garrett and Thomas accomplish? Could they open the doors of Johns Hopkins Medical School to women? And could they use their power of philanthropy to really make change and open up some spaces for women? So that's essentially what the book is about, how some very wealthy women at the late 19th century and early 20th century used the power of their philanthropy to make change for women. And in it, I show the power of that philanthropy. So how it did take women to make change for other women, that it was women giving thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars. They gave in much higher numbers than men gave. They gave more money than men gave to various women's causes. And that's true today. The Women's Philanthropy Institute down in Indiana at the Lilly School of Philanthropy has done a lot of studies on philanthropy that's directed towards women's causes today. And again, it's overwhelmingly coming from women for women. In the book, I focus on the women's suffrage movement, which is what I'm going to primarily focus on today, as well as this opening access to higher education for women. So I'll talk about that as well. And also funding for the birth control movement, as it was then called. So I'd be happy to take questions about that later on also. In the book, I show the power of their philanthropy, and then I also show some of the problems that their philanthropy engendered. So while we might be kind of cheering that Mary Garrett was really using her philanthropy to wield power with the trustees and the president at Johns Hopkins University, it was different within the movement itself. And so other middle-class women resented the power that some very wealthy women had, as well as the question of who it was they were trying to make change for. And was that inclusive? Were they extending those rights or working to extend those rights to everyone, regardless of race, across class, etc. So that's kind of what I'll focus on today. And just to back up for just a minute, a little bit of the history is that women had always been charitable, right? They were giving of themselves and also giving food, fuel, clothing, etc. Traditionally, in this kind of notion of a lady bountiful, a wealthy woman who is giving those things in a charitable way on a very individual basis to a family who she deems to be worthy. Although, of course, women were giving in many other ways as well. And there's a long tradition of generosity in which, you don't have to be wealthy to be a philanthropist, of course. By the time we get to the late 19th century, we're starting to see, with the Gilded Age, some very wealthy individuals, people like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller and Sage. And these folks are endowing million-dollar foundations, and they're changing their giving less from that sort of individual to help a family to more what we call scientific philanthropy, or the idea of changing the root cause. So rather than giving that food and fuel to a family, trying to look at the causes of poverty and put your philanthropy there, trying to look at the causes of disease, funding research, etc. And the idea there is to really, again, make more substantial change in society. At the same time, across the 19th century, we're beginning to have a much more formal women's rights movement. And the movement, while there are women who are looking for and calling for women's rights well before Seneca Falls in 1848, this is really when it does become more organized and we begin to hold these conventions. The Women's Rights Convention held in 1848 was the first one to be held really internationally. And after this, women were becoming even more organized through women's clubs, many different kinds of temperance and other organizations, and working for the common good as well as for their own rights. And I think both these trends really come together in the late 19th and early 20th century. And you have some very wealthy women who are trying to make that more substantial kind of scientific philanthropy change in society, but for women to really advance gender equity. So let's go back to Mary Garrett. As I said, she's from Baltimore. Her father was John Garrett. He was the owner of the B&O Railroad. If you're old enough to have played Monopoly, you might remember the B&O Railroad. And he died in the early 1880s when she was in her 20s. She was single. She's a very wealthy, white, privileged woman, right? She had some brothers, and she was really resentful because her brothers were allowed to go to college and her father would not let her go to college. Her brothers were allowed to work in the family business. She was not allowed to work in the family business. And then her brothers were allowed to control the investments and she was not allowed to control the investments. She was allowed to do some of the spending, so she had that privilege, but she really felt that as a woman, she was experiencing sex discrimination despite all of her other privileges. And so that set her on the path of really advocating for women's education. So she and friends started a school to train women to get into colleges so that they would be accepted. So secondary school, and then she gave a lot of support to Bryn Mawr College, and she supported the Johns Hopkins Medical School. So she came up with this idea to actually start a fund with other women. So they had branches of this fund all across the country. There's a branch in California, there's branches across the Midwest, lots of branches on the East Coast where she was from. I'm showing you the example from Chicago. You might notice that these are some very leading women, society women from Chicago, Mrs. Potter Palmer, also doctors. And if you look closely, they are all women, except for one. And so that again shows the power of women making change for women. There's something like over 700 women who all gave in this first phase of the Women's Medical School Fund, and something like 670 of them are women. So it was really overwhelmingly women who were making these changes for women. Dr. Gilman, who was the president of Johns Hopkins Medical School, was not very happy. And so his initial reaction was to sort of say, well, actually $100,000 is not enough. What we really need is $500,000. It was a little bit of a challenge to Garrett and to Thomas. And they took the challenge, they kept raising money, and then finally Garrett herself said, well, that's it, I'll give the rest. She ended up giving over $350,000 herself, and the rest of the money was raised by the other women. And at that point, Gilman really had not a lot of choice. And so he hemmed and hawed, and then he took the money. And when Johns Hopkins Medical School opened, it opened on the same terms for women as well as for men. Another important philanthropist from this time period is Mary Richardson Jones. She is one of the first Black families in Chicago, coming back in the 1840s, 1850s, when there were very few Black families in Chicago. Her husband was invested in, he was a tailor, and then he invested in real estate. And they were a wealthy family. When he died in 1879, he left her approximately $50,000. And so Mary Jones was very active in Chicago. She was very active in a lot of different Black organizations, and in particular in Black women's organizations. And you can see here, for example, she supported the Phyllis Wheatley Home Association, which was formed to help employ Black women at a time when the YWCA was still not serving Black women in Chicago. So she, like Garrett, was really very concerned about opening up access to education and to employment for Black people more generally, but more specifically for Black women. And she gave to a lot of other different organizations that were also promoting education and employment. Importantly, she was one of the big donors to the New Providence Hospital, which was founded in the 1890s in Chicago. A young Black woman wanted to get nursing training, and none of the nursing training schools in the area would include her. And so Mary Jones and several Black doctors and Black leaders in Chicago decided to open their own hospital that would serve Black patients in Chicago, as well as have a training school for nurses to provide the education and then, of course, the employment for them, and also employment for Black doctors in Chicago as well. So that was something that completely went along with Mary Jones's ideas about how to make lives better for Blacks in Chicago, and she was one of the substantial donors. Now, both Jones and Garrett were suffragists. So Jones apparently knew Susan B. Anthony, met with her in Chicago, and so did Garrett. Right before Susan B. Anthony's death in 1906, she met with Garrett and Thomas and asked Garrett to start a fund for the national organization. At that time, the national organization still had very limited funding and a small budget. And Anthony had been trying to go after some wealthy women, and she had gotten some donations, but it really still was not on very good financial footing. And so she asked Garrett to use those skills she had shown for the medical school and to create a $60,000 fund by soliciting a group of women across the country. And this time, rather than making it this kind of more expansive effort, she did have organizations in 6 different cities, and they solicited and got, I think it's 23 donors, of whom 19 were women. And there was also a couple there as well. So again, overwhelmingly women. They gave larger amounts of money, and they raised that $60,000 for NASA, for the national organization. There's no record of Mary Jones having given to the national organization, and in the national organization records, I'll show you a picture of one of them, but there's really very few mentions of Black women giving to those national organizations. So that's not to say that they didn't support the suffrage movement, both in terms of their activism as well as through financial donations, but often they were excluded from the national movement, which has been covered quite a bit recently in some articles and publicity around this 100th Amendment, so you may be more familiar with that now. But at times, Black women and other women of color were included in the movement. We do see them sometimes collaborating, speaking at national conventions, but there are other times when they are explicitly excluded, and also when white suffragists sometimes explicitly make the argument for suffrage based on only enfranchising white women. So there's definitely racism infecting the movement, as well as this kind of inclusion/exclusion going on. And so therefore what we see for Black women is a tendency more to work for suffrage through their own organizations, whether that would be a women's club that covered a whole range of reform activities, educational activities, and suffrage, or a club that was developed just to suffrage, like the one that Ida B. Wells, the well-known activist and journalist, founded in Chicago. And although this was after the death of Mary Jones, this certainly would have been the type of organization that she would have funded in Chicago. So I wanted to share this quotation from Melinda Gates. She's made quite a few substantial donations to fund gender equity. She's funded birth control access. She's funded several economic efforts for women, and then more recently, a big one for $1 billion. And in 2018, she said that this approach was really important to her because she thought that women working outside the home also changed men's perception of them. By defying a social norm, they started to change it. And so her idea then was to focus on employment. And if we can get women to have access to more employment opportunities and to get financial independence, they're also beginning to break down social norms about what it means to be a woman and what women's rights should be. And I found this to be really interesting, given the approach that we just saw Garrett and Jones take, right? In which they're not just suffragists who want the right to vote, right? They're suffragists, and they're also working for women's education, and they're also working for women's employment, and they see all these as tied together. So what I thought I would do just for a second is to kind of take a pause, see where we are, see if anyone has thoughts or questions so far, and in particular thoughts about this approach from the suffragists that I've talked about, as well as from Melinda Gates. And it's almost a little bit of a chicken versus the egg question. You know, what do you go for first? Obviously, you have to go for economic rights as well as political rights, as well as other rights also. But do you see any kind of a pattern in which working for one can bring about the other? So I'm going to open up my chat and see if anyone's got any thoughts that they want to share or questions about anything so far. And also take a look at some of these fantastic philanthropists that some of you have put up here.
And I know we have some students that are joining us today, but also some faculty members. So I'm also curious, you know, what you've heard in your classes or what kinds of thing you teach about this era and about women's philanthropy in general that you wanted to share with the group as well. You can unmute yourself, so if you want to pop your hand up or raise your digital hand, you can unmute yourself if you want to contribute.
While you're thinking if you want to have a question or not, I see that someone did have Melinda Gates, Eleanor Roosevelt, that's a great one, Alice Walton, I assume that's the Walton from Walmart, and she's the one who's founded the museum, I believe. That's the reference. Rihanna's a big supporter of education. I think that's one of her central causes that she's given quite a lot of money to. I love it that someone's called out local philanthropists, including Dr. Shadman. That's fantastic. And Jane Addams is a really interesting one because she did give her own money, and she also had a couple of women who substantially, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, funded Hull House as well. So that's a really interesting one. She had a lot of donors from across Chicago, some of the major, Mr. Fields from Marshall Fields, but she also, really the bulk of that money came from several women, including herself. So that's another interesting one. Dolly Parton is a great one. She's getting some more recent attention. And of course, the other is the National Association of Colored Women. So we can think about organizations and some of the leaders within that group. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who funded the magazine herself that she edited that talked about suffrage as well as other activities for Black women's clubs. And of course, Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker is the hair care products professional who was extremely wealthy in the early 20th century, lived most of her life in Indianapolis and then New York. And there's a new biography of her coming out by Professor Tyrone Freeman down in Indiana. And
Yeah, we're going to have him in November. I'm so excited.
oh, you all need to definitely tune in. In fact, I'm going to register for that one. He's terrific. And one of the things that I think is really important that he talks about is this notion of a culture of generosity, in which Walker was really giving from when she had nothing, when she was just I'm going to say, when she was a washerwoman who was poor herself, but would give anything that she could, and this kind of long tradition of giving, as opposed to some of the women that are in the book that I have, in which they were really become these known philanthropists once they've inherited a lot of money. And then the question is, okay, so now how do I spend this? And so I think it's a little bit of an interesting, different orientation as well. Okay, fabulous. So I'm going to go ahead. Thank you for all those. And if you think about, if you think of other questions, please let me know. And I am just going to share my screen again. Just going to take me just a second here. And then we'll keep going. All right, so what I'd like to do now is spend a little time on Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, because she's such a fascinating figure. And I think she reveals a lot of what I talked about earlier, which is both the power of philanthropy, and then she's somebody that we can use to think a little bit more about some of those relationships and what happened when wealthier women did try to think of sisterhood in a more expansive notion and reach across class and race divides. So Alva Vanderbilt Belmont is from Alabama. Her family moved up to New York, and she there met and married Willie K. Vanderbilt, who's the grandson of the Commodore who made all the money in railroads and other businesses, and who was kind of helped her. Then they entered society in New York City. She kind of had to claw her way in since they had new money. And she became very, very well-known society woman in New York City. In 1909, she started to support the suffrage movement. This was after the death of her second husband. And she was a tremendous financial supporter of the movement. So I alluded earlier to seeing a record of the gifts to the movement. So the National Women's Party, which was really the second national organization, kept this typewritten list. It's well over 200 pages, and they collected every single donation that they got when they started in 1913 all the way through the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And again, you can see these donations, 50 cents, $1, $5. So again, this notion, that it takes everyone to be active and to be giving, as well as someone like Belmont, who you can see halfway down the page, who gave $76,000. And she really did save this organization at times when its bank account was really down to, I think it went as low as maybe $12 at one point. And so she was really quite important. And she's important in part because she did have this big personality, and she loved being the center of attention. She loved the fact that as this, rich society woman, the newspaper was fascinated with her. And if she did something for the suffrage movement, she could get a lot of publicity and a lot of coverage. And she also really liked the more militant activities that Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party, was carrying through, such as the pickets at the White House, which were very controversial, held during World War I. And although Alva Belmont didn't participate in the pickets themselves, she did immediately say, how much money do you need? And Alice Paul said, I need $10,000 to get these pickets running. And Belmont immediately gave half that amount. She also, I love contrasting, because here you can see the White House, and on the bottom is her marble house, as it was known, her summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, which is where the wealthy New York society families summered and had these huge mansions. And so she came up with the idea that people wanted to see inside the houses, and of course they couldn't, they were private residences. So one day she opened up the mansion, and for $5 you could get a tour of the mansion, and then you came out in the back and she had the suffragists there, and they were having a rally and handing out information. So she was very creative in gaining lots of publicity and attention to the movement, as well as a lot of money to the movement. Therefore, it's not really surprising that when she first joined the movement in 1909, it was actually headquartered in Warren, Ohio. It was headquartered in Warren, Ohio, because that's where the treasurer lived. It was then still a relatively small organization. And so the treasurer basically had a desk in her house, and that was the headquarters of the whole organization. And when Belmont joined, not surprisingly, she said, well, that's not going to do. We need really to be in New York City, where we can get lots of attention, where we can build up a bigger organization and infrastructure. And so that meant that she offered them $7,000 and said, I'll give you $7,000, but only if you move headquarters to New York City. And that will pay the rent and furnishings and hire some staff. And so they took the money and they did move to New York, but you won't be surprised to find out that Harriet Upton quit. She resigned when she couldn't, when the headquarters was taken away from her. And she and others in the movement really protested this idea that Alva Belmont could force the organization to do something by offering money to them. That she was dictating with her dollars, she was wielding power, and that this was supposed to be an organization for equality, and instead there was this inequality within the organization. And I think this really was reverberating with folks in the movement at the time, because Congress was actually investigating J.P. Morgan, the leading banker in the country, and several of his associates for being a monopoly. I love this headline from the New York Times that said that congressional committee was claiming that 180 men controlled $25 billion, and this is from 1913. And so when you're reading the newspapers, you keep seeing money trust, money rule, money power. And when you read the letters from suffragists at the same time, you see those same things. It's not fair. Mrs. Belmont has money power. It's not fair. And they name other wealthy women as well. So I think that's another one of the potential problems, was that she really had to figure out how to kind of give her money more freely. And what we see today in a lot of women's foundations and women's organizations, giving circles, is a little bit more of a movement to have grantees have a say in what the money is going to do, sort of be more democratic in the way they do that kind of fundraising and giving out of funds. So why did Alva Belmont join the movement is a good question as well. And the reason really came in part because her husband, Willie, was blatantly cheating on her. And back in the 1890s, and she's clawing her way into high society in New York, it really wasn't done to get a divorce, but she got one anyway. But she was very angry, and she really argued that women were kept in subjection, that here she was, her husband was supposed to be, protecting her, and instead he was abusing her, and she was powerless to do anything about it. And so she, despite her wealth, despite her class, despite her race, she felt that she still experienced that same sex discrimination that we heard Mary Garrett talking about. And so she was quite angry, and she thought that really, if women got the right to vote, that would kind of change their place in society. It would give them more respect. They would be equal citizens. And then they could do all the other things that, that would allow them to improve, their education and their employment and all of those other things as well. But for her, the first step was really getting political empowerment so that they would be respected and they wouldn't be abused by men anymore. This kind of attitude, this anger at the way she was being treated by a man, led her to try to actually reach out beyond other wealthy women, especially to working class women. And so it's really interesting. Her argument to working class women really was, we're the same in that we're all being abused by men, and you're being abused by your abusive bosses. I'm being abused by my husband, and we all need to fight for the right to vote so that we can gain respect and then gain all the rights that we need to protect ourselves. She joined the movement in 1909, and that fall, in November of 1909, the shirtwaist manufacturing women, the women who were working in the garment factories in New York City, went on strike. And so Belmont and several other wealthy women and suffragists came out in favor of the strike pretty quickly, and she started to give some assistance. And so here you can see someone being arrested. One of the things that Belmont did was to pay for their bail so they could get out of jail. She even stayed till 3 in the morning one night in court to bail women out and put her mansion up as collateral for them. She also rented out the Hippodrome in New York City so that they could have this big rally, 8,000 people gathered to hear speeches on suffrage as well as on labor and their rights. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that she was really resented by a lot of the working class women, and they felt that she didn't recognize that they had already been suffragists before she came along. They had their own organization, that they knew what they wanted, the right to vote for, and that when she comes into the movement, she seems to be wanting to be their savior. She seems to want to do for them instead of with them. And so one great picture that I chose to sort of illustrate this is from the parade in New York in 1912 for the suffrage parade. And so Alva Belmont usually didn't march in parades, but she did march in this one. And she waited until after 5 p.m. so that the women from the garment factories could join the parade after work. But in the picture on the right, you see her, she's walking by herself. There she is, the leader. By herself. So again, this kind of notion of she's doing for them instead of with them. 2 months after that parade, in January of 1910, she also reached out to Irene Moorman Blackstone and 2 other Black suffragists in New York City to meet with them and to see if they wanted to form a branch of the PEA, which was the Political Equality Association, which was her suffrage organization that she founded herself and was trying to build up branches across New York City. So this is kind of an interesting situation. Moorman came from Virginia originally, and she had come up to New York City. She started working for the Metropolitan Realty Company. She's definitely a businesswoman and an entrepreneur. She was also very active in Black organizations, especially Black women's organizations. And she wanted there to be space for Black organizations to be able to come together and meet. Generally, they used churches because they didn't have their own space. And so she raised funds through the Metropolitan Businesswomen's Club, and then she incorporated her own company, the Mormon Harper Company, to run a space that they found. She's very, very active. She later will become a supporter of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, a Black nationalist organization. She at times worked with white women. She at times really advocated for self-sufficiency and political power for Blacks, and really that sort of pride that we see in the nationalist movement. She met with Belmont with Sarah Garnett and Maria Lawton. These were 2 other suffragists from New York City. Garnett was a long-standing suffragist. She had started the Equal Suffrage League in Brooklyn back in the 1880s, and she was the first Black principal in the New York City public schools. Maria Lawton was a journalist, And she was also a long suffragist. And all three of these women, again, as I said, were very active in Black women's organizations in particular, and Black organizations more generally. And as I said earlier, in terms of their activity, they at times collaborated with white women. We see them meeting with them, etc. And then there are times when they're excluded. And I think it's really interesting to think about, well, why would they have met with Belmont and why did she want to meet with them? And none of them explicitly says, they don't leave us any answers. There's no letters that they wrote explaining why they did it. But I think in Belmont's case, she had just recently gotten herself involved in the strike and supporting women across class. And I think she was really believing this rhetoric around this imagined sisterhood, that all women kind of had this shared experience. And so I think she did imagine that, you know, she could reach across race lines as well. And I'm sure she also wanted more members for her PEA so that she could have more power. Garnett, Lawton, and Mormon, I'm sure we're a little bit, probably a little intrigued by her celebrity. She was quite famous, you know, to go meet with her in her headquarters was kind of a big deal. They had this long history of at times being able to work with white women. And so I'm sure they, you know, wanted to have more power within the movement and take their rightful place within the movement. And I think Mormon really saw it as an opportunity to get that financial support that she was so active in seeking for Black organizations up to that moment. And so the idea that Belmont would pay for a headquarters for them, I'm sure was very important to Mormon, who had already been working for that goal for quite some time. So they got together in January. They went to Belmont's office and met with her there, the three of them. And then Mormon organized a meeting at a church, a Black church, Mount Olivet Baptist Church. Belmont spoke. After the meeting, about 20 or so Black men and women went back to Belmont's office and they started their own branch of the PEA. And then by that October, once they had 100 members, Belmont promised she would give them the headquarters once they had 100 members. And so that's what happened. Then they went and they had a Harlem branch of the organization. And I wanted to share this headline from the New York Times because it really echoes that sort of attitude that it seems like Belmont is sort of inviting Black women to join the suffrage fight and to join her organization, when of course we just saw these women have been suffragists for many, many years, right? And so they already are in the suffrage fight, but they are joining her organization. Their ideas about suffrage were a little bit different from some of her ideas as well. And so Mormon says to a group of white women, equal suffrage means the square deal for every people. Remember, don't do anything for us because we are colored men or women, but make it humanitarian because it's right. And so she really echoes this long argument for the right to vote based on human rights, based on natural rights, based on citizenship, and that all women and people regardless of color are should have that natural human right of citizenship and therefore the right to vote. And that it's for not just women, but it's for Black men and women. And I think it's notable that some of Belmont's rhetoric about her anger at men may not have sat that well with members of this branch, because notably they're referred to in the newspapers as the Negro Men's and Women's Branch. They're the only one that has the name men in it. And it was men who went with women, again, both to the meeting at the church as well as to the meeting to set up this branch. And so I think this really shows us that Belmont did not have a good understanding, or if she had any understanding, of intersectionality and the really lived experiences of Black women in which they were fighting to advance gender equity, but at the same time, they were also fighting alongside Black men for civil rights for Blacks. And so didn't necessarily share that sort of attitude that brought her into the movement. They also were suspicious of her. We know that a lot of Black suffragists were suspicious of white women, didn't necessarily trust them, and for good reason. So Mormon talks about how she asked Belmont, well, if we are, are going to work with you, does this mean that you're going to support Black women getting the right to vote and not allow us to have the right to vote taken away from us the way that Black men have had the right to vote taken away from them in the South, despite the 15th Amendment? So, and Mormon reports that Belmont assured me that if it were made the law that women might vote, the right would not be denied them. The 14th and 15th Amendments, she said, would be carried into effect. With this assurance, Mormon said, sure, we'll join your organization and work with you. However, Mormon's fears were really prescient. She understood what was coming, and shortly thereafter, within several months, the PEA began to exclude the Black branch from some of their meetings and activities, from a lunchroom. And then finally, by 1911, Belmont really moved away from supporting Black voting. Kate Gordon was a white woman from New Orleans who was a virulent racist, was very explicit in her arguments that only white women should have the right to vote and not Black women. And she started the Southern States Women's Suffrage Conference, and Belmont, who at this point has been gone from the South for 55 years, she moved when she was 6 years old, she writes Gordon this effusive letter about how she so deeply feels her Southern identity, and she, unsolicited, sends Gordon a check for $10,000 to support her organization. And by that November, at Gordon's conference, Belmont tells the conference in the newspapers she's no longer supporting Black women voting. She says Negro women could share the rights of Negro men. If they are disfranchised, let women share the same treatment. So she's really backtracked from what she had earlier told Mormon. So I'm going to stop there with the story of Alva Belmont, but I hope that it really shows the power of women's philanthropy, the way that they really could use their activism as well as their dollars to make substantial changes in the movement. And the way that it really took women to do that. They did have male supporters. You can see the men up in the top corner. And those male allies were really important. They're still really important today. But then, as I think now, they were primarily the husbands, the sons, the fathers of women suffragists. And so I think it's really important that women are active and they do work to advance gender equity and bring men into the movement to support as well. They also, I think the women that we've talked about so far really show the way that they could make a difference, the way that their giving did matter. And I just wanted to show a couple things. One is a study from the Women's Philanthropy Institute that showed what they called quote unquote rage giving after the last election, and how that dramatically increased, and women really saw themselves as needing to give funding in order to make change after that election, and also to make a difference in terms of who was running for Congress. And so a study of giving to Congress shows that women's donations have increased, but most importantly, they've increased for women candidates. And so the top recipients of women's money comes to women candidates, and those women candidates get the majority, more than half their money from women. So I think it really is women who are putting women into Congress, which is really important as well. And I think that the story of Alva Belmont and Irene Mormon also really shows us that we need to be thinking about who these women were, why they wanted the right to vote, and the ways in which we have to go beyond the racism that infected the movement then, that we really have to think about and confront the racism that continues to infect feminism today, to really do better and to work to avoid that kind of inequality in a movement for equality, so that we can become a model for a movement that works to advance gender equity as well as human rights, social justice, and anti-racism. So I'm going to stop right there.
So we've definitely had some questions in the chat. So
Wonderful.
I kind of want to start with a little bit of a broader discussion maybe, and anybody who wants to chime in on here is just this notion of philanthropy. We teach classes in philanthropy and fundraising here in our undergraduate program. I've taught them at the graduate level. And there's maybe some different kinds of definitions of what is philanthropy, and is it just about the size of gift? So I'd be interested if you want to share your thoughts on that and what you see in the historical record.
Yeah, so absolutely, it's not just about the size of gifts. I do argue in this book that there were some very substantial gifts that made a demonstrable change that we can really see. So we can see some of the tactics and the strategies that some of the very large gifts paid for in the women's movement, in the suffrage movement, that they really just couldn't fund previously. So one of the things they were very interested in was newspapers, and that was really important, but they couldn't make any money, and they were sinking thousands of dollars at a time when they just didn't have thousands of dollars to have those and to really reach the public. So when Mrs. Frank Leslie died in 1914, she gave her entire estate to the Carrie Chapman Catt, who becomes president of the national organization. And Catt comes out with, nearly $1 million. And the first thing that she does is to hire 25 publicists to start this entire publicity campaign. She called it an education campaign. And she buys back the Women's Journal, which they had gotten rid of because it was losing so much money. And she sinks $75,000 into it in the first year, when the entire budget the previous year for the whole organization had been $38,000. So having that kind of money at her disposal, I think, was really important, and it really did make a difference. The same thing, in the Johns Hopkins example, right? Women weren't going to be allowed into Johns Hopkins without that $500,000 donation. So we can see a lot of examples where these big donations are really important. But the other thing that the movement really had to do was to show that they were a mass movement. One of the arguments that they were fighting was that women didn't really want the right to vote, right? So they really had to get women involved. They had to get women in the streets. They had to get millions of women to support the movement. And so I think the activism, again, philanthropy, not just as money, right? But the activism of all of those women, as well as all those 50-cent and $1 donations that we saw across the country, I think are really, really important as well. And today, the first Women's March, they opened up an online campaign and raised something like $2 million from, I want to say, 38,000 donors. So again, it's like a $50 donation. So again, these are small donations, but really, really important. And I think that that is very important. And that's a point that Professor Freeman will make as well, that he makes with Madam Walker, that her first donations, when they were small, are just as important to consider and to think about as the donations when she was able to make $1,000 or a $5,000 donation to a women's school or to the Y. But those early donations were really important too.
So maybe we've had a couple of questions about what kind of sparked your interest in the topic, and then also your process. So as a faculty member, there's all different methodologies that we use, and you're a historian. So kind of two parts: what made you interested? Why did you pursue this line of interest of research? And then what was your process, and how did you find access to these documents and data?
So I've been studying women's history for a long time. And initially was looking at Black and white women's clubs in South Carolina at their activism, and spent the first, portion of my career focused on what women were doing and why they were doing it. So, you know, what kinds of schools were they building and how were they trying to make change for women and how were they trying to empower communities and those kinds of things. And about 10 years ago or so, there was so much publicity around campaign donations that I just kind of had one of those light bulb moments and really thought about, well, I need to think about how they were able to finance these organizations that they were running and how they were able to do the things that they did to make the change that they did. And a lot of it is hidden, but I did have to go back and reread the financial records in the archives and start to look at a group of women who I hadn't necessarily focused on quite as much to get at some of these bigger stories of bigger change. I had already covered some of the fundraising and some of the smaller donors in the books on what they were doing. And then this led me to think a little bit more about a few very powerful women. So, and in terms of the second question, I'm a historian, so spent a lot of time in the archives, reading old letters, organization records, pouring through the records of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, as well as white women's clubs, through different suffrage organizations, through Planned Parenthood and a lot of other organizations that were supporting birth control. And really, I'm looking at organizational records, I'm looking at letters between women, and then I'm looking at also kind of the publicity. So what are the newspapers reporting? What's kind of out there more publicly around these movements?
Sounds amazing. Now, what are your thoughts on a lot of these women? Was that by the sound of your descriptions, a lot of it was inherited money, either through fathers or husbands and things like that. What do you see as the big shift today, that we have more women earning their wealth rather than inheriting? And do you think that's changed anything in terms of their philanthropy, that they might not be as beholden to where that money came from as they might have been in the past?
Yes, and one of the differences I think it makes is that it allows them to kind of give more consistently to the causes that they want to give to, because they do have more financial control. And I think in some ways it mitigates some of that sort of taboo around the idea of women and money and using money as power when they have earned it and are seen as women, right? And then that sort of allows them to be more powerful and directive with their giving. Many of the women that I studied, the vast majority actually, were either single women or widows, a couple cases of divorces or just very unhappy marriages. And so in most cases, they're sort of giving, despite men or without men. There's a few cases of sort of what appear on the surface at least to be happy marriages and supportive husbands in which women are giving. But in most cases, that is not the case. Olivia Sage cannot really give generously until her husband dies. Belmont really gets free to give what she wants to, you know, who she wants once her second husband dies. So there's a lot of situations like that. Catherine McCormick, her husband, unfortunately has a breakdown and is institutionalized. And so then she's sort of almost an independent woman, and she starts to give and then gives even more after he actually dies. So in a lot of different cases, these were women who didn't feel empowered to give immediately, in part due to that sort of inheritance and role within the family. And so I do see a difference today. I think that's really important.
And on the horizon, do you have suggestions or ideas how we need to further some of this research? What else needs to be done to really broaden our understanding of women in philanthropy, either in this era or the current era, that you think just needs a little bit more attention?
That is a great question. I think that my book is really the first to cover this topic in this way. There have been some others on women's giving, but not really focused on women giving for women historically in this time period. And I think we need a lot more work continuing on women's giving in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century. I covered a little bit, but it's fairly limited. And women's giving to the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, as well as currently today. And we are seeing some more attention to it, but in particular to women's role within social justice movements today, whether it's specifically for women's causes or more broad social justice movements today. So I think we need to learn a little bit more about the mid-20th century and then really connect the dots from the early 20th century through the mid and up into the present.
I know one of the things that I was fascinated to hear is that to a certain extent this is still done, but that donors feel some sense of ownership if they're contributing significantly to an organization. And that's a delicate balance for nonprofit organizations that I study in the current realm, when you have a donor but the organization wants to move in a different direction. And you talked a little bit about some of the tension, certainly, but is there anything else you wanted to comment on there regards to how much were the donors actually driving agendas versus supporting this broader mission?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think in this case, in the case of suffrage, obviously the mission itself, right, is they're all sharing. So what they're driving more, I think, are some of the strategies and tactics, as well as some of the leadership. There were times when Belmont was very specific about who she wanted to be president of the organization. And there were some other moments as well. Catherine McCormick was accused of the same thing when she made some decisions because of her donations. So I do think that in this case, it was a little bit more about the tactics and which way the movement was going to go to achieve the same goal. But in other cases, certainly there could be some difference. One of the things that I think is interesting about the early birth control movement is that Sanger initially really was, all of her rhetoric was around women's independence and need for reproductive rights in the first 10 years or so. And during that time period, she was really surrounded by some fierce feminists who were giving and who shared those ideas about why women should have the freedom to control their own bodies. And it's really later, as some of those, that group that was supporting her, one gets divorced, another one dies, they sort of all fade away, essentially. And that's happening simultaneously with when eugenics starts to become more popular and Sanger starts to go off in that direction. So I think that's a kind of interesting situation in which, I kind of see some of those women as really holding her to her feminism early on. And, they're not there to sort of hold her to that later on. Now, whether she would have moved in that direction or not, I can't really say, but certainly she was no longer surrounded by those feminist donors, and she was seeking donors in other places. So that could certainly be a situation where you see that kind of
one of the interesting things when I teach about volunteerism and donors, and I think this holds true, so I was just interested in historic, is that women tend to volunteer with an organization first. They really want to get to know what's happening, and then their giving tends to increase over time the deeper the engagement. And in the current times, that seems to hold true, that there's very much a gender distinction between women who give versus men who give. Men don't have the same requirement to really volunteer for an organization before they give, or even be part of a leadership, whether that's serving as a board or board president. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, if you've seen that historically.
I would not really say that that was the case historically, because for everyone I can think of who was very active in the movement and who sort of does follow that sort of pattern that we see today, I can think of someone else who doesn't.
Yeah.
And I do think that goes back to your earlier question about where they're getting their economic power and if they're earning it themselves, because in some of those cases, some of the women who in fact were not active because they were trying to sort of be quiet about their giving, and they're giving either anonymously or they're just giving a check and not wanting to take part in a march in the streets. In other cases, they're actually trying to hide their giving from their husbands. There's one story that one of the women who worked with Belmont to fundraise from some other wealthy women tells that, they actually had one wealthy woman who told them that she pretended to buy a hat and she would sort of charge it, and then she would get the money back and give it to them. So she had to sort of go through this process to hide from her husband what she was actually spending the money on, and let him think she was spending it on a hat, when in fact she was then getting the money back and giving it to suffrage. So I do think that some of the reason for why that's not as much the case in this time period as it is today may be this kind of reluctance on the part of some of these women to really be seen as engaged in the organization, and so they're giving quietly. In other cases, definitely the more active they get, the more they give.
So I see a question from Dr. Littauer. Did you want to speak, Amanda? It might be nice to have another voice on here besides myself and Joan Marie. Do you want to unmute yourself? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Joan. So nice to see
Hi,
you.
it's so good to see you.
One thing I wanted to say is just how wonderful the Newbery lecture series was that you helped set up. And so thank you for doing that. And I miss it.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. So my question is just about the, romantic private relationships, and often, the vocational partnerships in a way, right? That like these women, many of them, to my understanding, set up with one another, right? And there are all the questions in women's history about, whether the term Boston marriage is really appropriate and how much we can know about romantic and erotic partnerships, right? So I was just wondering sort of how this history intersects the history of lesbianism or same-sex relationships in the early 20th century.
Yeah, it's a great question. So as I said, a lot of these women are either widows or they're single women, and many of them were in fact partnered with other women, including, for example, Mary Garrett and M. Carey Thomas, who do become lovers and partners for many, many years. And I do think that we're really only scratching the surface now of beginning to understand what that meant and how that really impacted how they thought about what and why they were working for. So when they're thinking about advancing gender equity and they're thinking about some of these rights for employment and for education and for the right to vote, what does that mean to them as women who do not anticipate being in a heterosexual marriage? What does that mean for them as women who see themselves as needing to support themselves or to live independently? I think that's really important. And furthermore, what does that mean for them in situations where, particularly in the suffrage movement, where there's discussion around kind of womanhood and And they are breaking some of those kinds of gender norms about who or what a woman should look like or be, right? So gender identity as well as sexuality. So I would say that that some of the women that I studied, notably Mary Garrett, certainly fall into that category. And I think if we look at the movement more broadly, many of the leaders of the suffrage movement, as you know, were partnered with other women. And I just think we're now at that point where we're beginning to just kind of understand why that actually matters and what that can tell us about what some of these women were fighting for.
Thank you. Any other questions in the chat? I know there's a few students that are online with us today. I'm happy to hear from any of our students that are here today. We look like we have a question from the person joining us on the iPhone. So if you want to unmute yourself, or I can unmute you if that's a little bit harder to do, go right ahead.
Hello, hi, Dr. Johnson. Thank you so much for this very informative presentation. And I just have a quick question for you. I was just wondering, as a historian and as a researcher, how difficult was it for you to find some of these documents?
So that's a really interesting because things have changed so much in the last 10 years that what I was doing at the beginning of this project is not what I would necessarily need to be doing today. And I can see Dr. Littauer nodding in agreement with that. I was really having to investigate where different collections were housed at archives and travel around the country and go into archives and look at physical documents, physical pieces of paper, old letters. And for the most part, because those are gathered into the archives, they are available and you can get the rights to use them, to quote from them, et cetera, you know, for a book like this. As I was going through the process, things were becoming more and more digitized. And so while I initially started looking at the microfilm records from the Suffrage Association and from some other plates, many more of them are online now. And you can go to the Library of Congress website. Jane Stanford, for example, I looked at her papers. And a lot of those are now available online. So I did go to Stanford into the archives to see some in person, but a lot of other ones I was able to.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, you accidentally, I accidentally muted. Sorry, go ahead, sorry.
So a lot of that is actually available now. And I didn't really encounter any issues with any of these pieces being not available for use. So certain collections, archives will not allow you to use or to quote extensively from. There are private collections which could be problematic if you're following an individual person and you really want their personal letters. You know, sometimes you could have a problem, but I didn't really encounter any problems like that with this book.
Thank you. Any other questions from our audience today? I will put in the chat, if you're interested in attending our future events, certainly check all our events out on Eventbrite. They're free and open to the public. We'd love to have you back. You can follow us on social media and all that good stuff. On Monday, our office manager will send out a link to the recording and an online evaluation form. Anything, Joan, that you wanted to add that we, final thoughts?
No, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, and I hope everyone is a little bit challenged as well as inspired.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone, and we look forward to you coming back to another program. Thank you.
Thank you.